hello, BookTube. Well, it's the 1st of May, and that's a time when a lot of booktubers make a May TBR, list all the books they feel like reading in May, all the books that look interesting. I love those videos. I love them especially for their mix of new stuff and old stuff. Just here's what the yen that I feel like doing, here's the theme that I feel like imposing on my TBR. I often feel a little bit distanced from those TBR videos because, of course, my reading isn't like that. My remit is new releases in the American market. So I'm not sitting there at the beginning of the month, usually, saying that the main thing I'm going to read is vintage science fiction. I might read some vintage science fiction in that month. There's scarcely a month when I don't. But there'll be no theme like that. And also, there'll be a lot of books. Far too many to include in one video. I'm hoping to read at least 100 books in May. And I'm well along my way to doing that. But I used to do a compromise video on this channel. Not a TBR, to be read, but a TBR-BY, to be read by you, where I take a chance at the beginning of the month to recommend some books that are coming out in that month that I've already read. And I let TBR-BY sort of slide. I don't quite know why. And one of you sent me an email. My email is on every video. Feel free to email me about any of you. One of you sent me a profanity-laced email abusing me and my forebears and saying that I really should revive the TBR-BYs. And once I got over my blushes, I agreed. So I have put together a TBR-BY for May of books that I think you should think about. Books that, for one reason or another, you might want to put on your own TBR. So we'll start out with an author who really needs no introduction. This is Michael Lewis. In May, there are 3... what a reviewing friend of mine and a book editor friend of mine refers to as mansplaining titles. There's a cadre of white male figures, white male authors, who pretty much have a steady gig of doing mansplaining books, of having some sort of weird, guys only bib overall obsession for a couple of months, writing a self-indulgent book about it, and getting a mainstream major publishing contract and universal wall-to-wall critical coverage. And May has not 1, not 2, but 3 of those. There's Sebastian Junger's book, Freedom, in which he and his buddies ride the rails for a little while to see what that's like in America. There's what's it called again? Neil Ferguson's book, The Politics of Doom, I think is what it's called, or The Politics of Catastrophe. I'm terrible with titles. But one way or another, that's another one. Neil Ferguson's another bloated mansplainer who has just a steady gig doing that. And the third one is Michael Lewis, who a lot of you will know. A lot of you will have read a couple of his books. Moneyball, for instance. He's written a lot of books that sold lots of copies and that were really good. Not all mansplainers have to be bad. And he has a new book coming out in May called The Premonition, which is a COVID-19 book. We are going to get an ocean of COVID-19 books. There are, in May alone, there are something like 10 titles coming out. 4 or 5 of them are explicitly and angrily political. There's going to be quite a few of those, especially aimed at the Trump administration, and especially as more information comes out about how negligent and deceitful the Trump administration was about COVID-19 in the early months when it might have made a difference, when the country might have been spared 500,000 people dead. The number would probably still have been high, no matter what, but as more and more historical records come to light, more and more people go on record, I think more and more angry political autopsies of that whole thing will come out. But a few of those are out already, or will be coming out in May. Lewis's book is different than that. It's sort of a story of on the front lines of people who were getting the titular premonition about how bad this thing may be. And, I'm putting it on this list because Lewis writes interesting books. That isn't always true of Neil Ferguson or Sebastian Junger, but with Michael Lewis, it is true. He writes interesting books. And the point that I want to make, this is worth your time to read. It's not going to take long. It's not a very big book. But it's intensely personal. It's intensely readable. And the one point that I want to make about it, I am also going to make about all of its brethren, which is that the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the biggest historical events of any of our lives. And that makes it important. That means that those of you who are inclined to read nonfiction or ripped from the headlines history, modern history, history of things that are still developing. Those of you who are inclined to read those kinds of things, or like me, are inclined to read new releases just in general, just broad church, don't really have the right to say, another COVID book. You don't have the right to do that any more than you have the right to say another World War II book. This is a gigantic historical event. The fact that it's still unfolding doesn't change that. So I granted, I will probably hit overload on these things, but it has to be done anyway. Just like, for instance, Trump books. During the last 4 years, Trump books were also a flood, a tsunami on the publishing world. But they had to be read, and there's a second wave of that tsunami coming. Those Trump books had to be read because it was extremely historically significant that America was openly flirting with becoming an autocracy. A one-party state, dictator-led autocracy. It was extremely historically important that America was openly flirting with that. And that caused, that kind of flirtation, the outrage or the adulation that it caused whole bunches of people to rush to press with Trump books. And that caused the first tsunami, and that was before the president incited a mob to sack the capital of my country, execute his own vice president, overturn a legal election, and install himself as an autocrat. Since that has now literally happened, that there will be a second tsunami of such books, for and against. And I will read them because that is historically significant. But it pales in significance with the historical significance of a pandemic that paralyzed the whole world. And is still paralyzing the whole world. So that's my sort of broad urging for those of you who may be in the little sweet spot of being open to reading these books at all, to read them all. I will certainly read them all. and Lewis has certainly made that fairly easy. There have only been a couple before him. And he made that easy because, like I said, his books are very readable. The next one is an author I don't often get along with, Olivia Lang. Her new book is Funny Weather, and it's a collection of her occasional prose, her deadline prose, on all sorts of things, all sorts of artists, art movements, cultural movements, literary movements. It's one of those collection books that I tend to like, even from authors whose novels or short stories I don't like, mainly because pieces like this will be edited. An editor will ride herd on them. An editor will curb the dumb, navel-gazing Gen Z excesses of the author and encourage their strength. The editors are usually thanked very briefly in the acknowledgement section. They are the unsung heroes here. But nevertheless, I thought this book was terrific, mainly probably for that reason. Then the next one is also an anthology, but not of only one author. This is something we've seen on this channel before. I wanted to plug it one more time. It's John Freeman is the editor, and he edits a slim, but boy, is it memorable, anthology called The Penguin Book of the Modern American Short Story. I thought it was just terrific. I have a feeling that it will probably be a Penguin Black Spine Classic next year, or the year after that. It's a terrific anthology. It makes some concessions to the 21st century that I at first didn't like. There are a great many stories in here that are shorter than 4 pages. And the table of contents at first glance could look like it is being falling victim to the 21st century's forced inclusiveness. But that was just a first impression. The short stories in here are still really good for the most part. And the inclusiveness only adds to the table of contents. The inclusiveness here on John Freeman's watch was not done for window dressing reasons. The authors are almost all really pulling their weight. So as far as a short story anthology goes, we're going to have, as far as I know, we're going to have 4 major publisher short story anthologies along one theme or another in 2021. I'd be surprised if any of them are better than this one. So if you like short story anthologies and maybe are looking for one that's a little bit unconventional, one that doesn't look quite like all the others, this is the one for you. Then we'll move on to a romance novel. This is The Undercover Duke by Sabrina Jeffries. Sabrina Jeffries wrote a romance novel. I wonder, I didn't prep, so I don't know that I have it here. She wrote a romance novel. There's Married to the Viscount, but that's not the one I'm thinking of. No, okay. I don't have the one here, and I'm blanking on the title. I didn't jot it down. But I think romance readers will probably know what I'm talking about. Sabrina Jeffries wrote a book in the series of Undercover Duke. It was, I think, 3 books ago. I forget the name of it, but it was terrific. Absolutely terrific. A standout even for this author who's usually very, very good. And Undercover Duke is very much captures the. I really should have figured out. I'll put it in the show notes down below if when I post the video what the book is I'm talking about, because it's gone right out of my head. Oh, that is just annoying. Well, anyway, it doesn't matter because we're talking about Undercover Duke, and Undercover Duke is a modern Regency romance of the type that I love, as you can see, and it's terrific, just terrific. Along the same lines, you know the drill already with these modern Regency romances. The woman will be strong-willed. Usually in the 21st century, she will also be able to live a life on her own. A goal that is absent from earlier Regency romances where the woman needs to marry. That goes all the way back to Pride and Prejudice, where the woman doesn't really have an existence on her own. She will either marry or she'll be a governess. But she won't be able to live on her own. Whereas modern Regencies tend to have that at least be on the cards. She's going to end up living as the mistress, as the married partner of someone who has massive landed wealth. She's going to end up that way. But the modern Regencies tend to make it so that she doesn't need to in order to not be a governess. But also the clashing of personalities, which is Sabrina Jeffrey's best thing. It's the best thing that she does in the modern Regency quiver, is clashing personalities. She does that fantastically well. I had a smile on my face the whole time. And I couldn't have the list without a romance on it. Now, could I? The next one is a bit of a surprise. An author I have not liked. This is a work of nonfiction. Maybe that explains it. But I also thought it was more heartfelt, a lot less gimmicky than the fiction. The author is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and the book is Notes on Grief, a nonfiction account of the death of her father, and set in the broader context of COVID-19, of the worldwide pandemic, that made visiting, caring, and also grieving suddenly difficult. Suddenly those everyday ordinary things, they might not have been pleasant, but we all knew how to do them. Everyone in the world knew how to do them, and suddenly they were hard or impossible. And this book captures, it is in a sense another COVID book of the tsunami that is cresting right now, that is going to strike this year. But boy, oh boy, if they could all be this heartfelt, this beautifully written, this wrenching, well, I'd be very happy about that. I'd be very sad for the loss of the authors, but I'd be very happy if that were the kind of literature we were getting. I think it is the first great COVID book. So I wanted to put it on your radar, especially since if you've watched this channel, again, with unhealthy consistency, you might think, look at the author's name and think, oh, Steve says that author's no good. No. I almost never say that an author is no good. I try to, not to anyway, because an author can change. An author can surprise me. I have not liked this author's fiction. But this book's terrific. I wanted to make sure you knew that I knew that I thought that. The next one is a comic writer that I quite like, and it's for the gays, because you got to give the gays something. And this is Playing the Palace by Paul Rudnick, who's been at this a long time. He's been writing a Stephen Levitt type light gay fiction for a long time. His have bite and genuine comic chops to them. And this is a story about a Crown Prince of England who is gay, and a party planner who is gay but doesn't think that anything is. He doesn't think he's ever going to find romance anymore. But when we meet him at the beginning of this book, he is pretty dinged up by the world and isn't really expecting anything. And they fall in love, and they fall into other things as well. And it's wonderfully done. It's funny on every page. It ends up being very moving, as Paul Rudnick's books always do. And it naturally is going to feel like a strong echo of current events because it's an American out of nowhere gaining the attraction of a Prince of the Realm, and that has hit the headlines with Harry and Meghan. I loved it, just loved it. It's actually one of the few books on this list that I would really like a print copy of. I just haven't got one yet. I don't know if I will. I haven't got one yet. Then the next one is an author it's like Adichie. I would never usually recommend this author. I usually just let his books go. They're not bad. They're usually pretty good examples of the thriller genre, but only pretty good. So they're not egregiously bad. They're not, Islamophobic, and they're not terrific. They're not just leaping off the page and making me want to say, hey, this is terrific stuff, even though it's derivative thrillers. The author is Stephen Hunter, and I usually just leave him alone. But his new book in May is Basil's War. And it feels like, I don't even know how to describe it. When I was reading it, my thought was, somebody got Stephen Hunter good and drunk. But that isn't true. That can't be true, because alcohol ruins books. It doesn't make them better. It ruins them. Instead, what that reaction really boiled down to is that it feels uninhibited. That's what I think I meant with that reaction of him, somebody got him good and drunk, is that this book feels uninhibited. Not in, Stephen Hunter's a fairly straight-laced author, so he's not going to be totally uninhibited, but it feels like he intentionally set out to write a good thinking man's romp of an adventure story about Basil St. Florian, this gin-guzzling secret agent during World War II, who's on an improbable Indiana Jones-style quest that you're not supposed to believe or take seriously. And it totally works. Just totally works. Again, if I had Stephen Hunter's ear, if I had some way to communicate with him, I would tell him, you already have a solid fan base, and you already have more money than God. Make your Basil St. Florian books into something along the same lines and venerated in the same way as Raffles or Smiley or Flashman. Make it that series of books and don't do anything else. Just keep having this much fun. Why do you need to go back to, ex-CIA agent Biff who fights terrorists on open plane doors? Why do you need to go back to that sort of thing that is rightly derided as airport fiction? Why not just write this stuff instead? Who knew? This stuff is amazing. Basil's War is amazing. I would never thought I would say that about a Stephen Hunter novel. So if you see it and you're thinking, maybe what I would have thought, Stephen Hunter, yeah, he's sort of a mid-range political thriller type writer. He's always steady. You know you're going to like him, but if he has a new book, I don't need to worry about it. I would probably have thought the same thing if I hadn't read this thing, but I'm now in a position to tell you, don't write this off. You will really enjoy it. Where does that leave us? Oh yeah, we've got plenty more to go. Next one is historical fiction set in Boston of 1862. Or 1662, sorry, not 1862. It would be a very different novel. Nobody ever sets books in my favorite period. This is 1662 Boston, so you'll be thinking, a little bit before the Salem witch trials, you'll be thinking that sort of thing, and you should be. It's Chris Bohjalian. Is that how you say his name? Bohjalian? One way or another, I might not know how to say his name, but you know the name because he's a massively best-selling author. And he wrote a book called Hour of the Witch. It's a historical novel about a young woman who is married to a monster. She's married to just a horrible ogre of a person. She's not his only wife, and it's pre-modern Boston, and she feels lost. And her husband is getting worse all the time, verbally abusive, but also physically abusive, to the point where she feels certain that she has to leave him, knowing perfectly well how merciless an era she's living in towards women who make those kinds of decisions, which is a word that can come up. And unlike today, back then, someone starts to call you a witch, you could die for it. You could certainly lose your liberty for it. And I've never been a big fan of this author, and I thought this book would, it looks very simple on the surface, so it will probably stay simple, but I didn't think it was. I thought it was outstanding. By far the best thing I've ever read from this author. By far. And worth your time. If you like historical fiction, then one of the highest profile items of historical fiction in the month is well worth your time. In May, there is also appearing other historical fiction that's also worth your time. It's not on my list, but only because you've heard it from me a million times. W.W. Norton in May is coming out with a beautiful reprint of the entire run of the Aubrey and Maturin novels by Patrick O'Brian with new cover art. Beautiful, beautiful cover art. I'm hoping that you will see printed copies of those on this channel in due course. But one way or another, oh my, naturally, it'll probably be 20 years before there's another full-scale reprint of these things. So naturally, I want to sing that. But I've sung the praises of those books way too many times, so I thought I would include Hour of the Witch instead. Then we'll move on to biography. You can't have a list like this without biography. In this case, it's the painter Albrecht Dürer, who is great, fantastic. He's one of those painters in the long, long history of painting where you only have to glance at one of his paintings to know that it's him and not anyone else. I kind of love that, and I also find his story fascinating. I've read many, many books about him, and this new one is by Philip Hoare, and it's called Albert and the Whale, because there's a reason for the title, but the title is a little bit misleading because it's not just about one incident and one piece of inspiration in Dürer's life. It's about his whole life and his art, and it's wonderful. just wonderful. It spends a lot of time on one incident of the artist going to look at a whale carcass. And that's probably predictable because Philip Hoare wrote a terrific book called The Whale. Really worth your time. If your library has a copy, really worth your time. The Whale is a book. But this isn't just, this isn't what the title seems to suggest. This is a guy with a whale obsession who's also writing a little bit about a famous painter. And the book is more than that. It doesn't function as a full-dress biography. There is one of those coming in the world. I'm really hoping. I think there's a gigantic biography of Dürer coming out, I think, next year in German. If I'm right, it's coming out in German or in Dutch. And then maybe 10 years after that, we'll get an English translation if any of us are still here, one way or another. This works as a biography and certainly as a biographical sketch. So if you're interested in the period or in the artist himself, you should give it a try. But you might want to give it a try anyway, because this is a case where I'm recommending the author as much as I am the book. Then we can move on to another author that I strongly recommend. I've read his last two or three books and really thought they were thought-provoking. The author is Akhil Reed Amar, and the book is The Words That Made Us. And it's about the long process of building a written constitution and ancillary documents in the United States. This guy's two previous books were about the Constitution, and I thought they were wonderful. I didn't always agree with them, but I thought they were wonderful reading. And this is too. A really good historical grasp, but also, at times, a thrilling kind of thinking about what the document actually means. What some of its provisions, even its less famous provisions, are actually saying. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, you're not going to find a better writer working today on the subject than this guy. And he has a new book coming out in May. Then the next one, I'm going to try with the name here. It's Suyi Davies Okunboa. He is a Nigerian writer, and he has a fantasy novel called Son of the Storm, the first book in an ongoing series coming out in May, that draws heavily on non-Western mythology, non-Western mythological concepts, in much the same way as Marlon James' latest, his big fantasy novel, which I always get wrong. I always want to call it Crouching Dragon, Hidden Tiger. But it's not that. But one way or another, you know the book I'm talking about, because it was all over BookTube 2 years ago. This is along the same lines, very much drawing from a different mythological backdrop, and doing it in a wonderful way. The main character is, he has his whole life set out. He knows what his life is going to be. The classic gimmick of fantasy. He knows what the shape his life is going to have. And then it radically goes off course and is driven off course by a kind of indigenous infused folklore magic that he didn't think existed. If the rest of the books in this series are this good, then I'll be looking forward to the next one anyway. But Son of the Storm will probably make my coveted end of the year list. So if you like fantasy and are looking for something that is very much not like what you've read before, you might want to try this one. Then this next one might be something that you've read before. It's a reprint novel. I talked about the reprint of Patrick O'Brian. This is a reprint of a very different kind, but nevertheless so good. It's one of those gigantic, super heavy, cinder block sized, $150 hardcover comic book anthologies. Do I have one near me here? No, I don't. But you've seen a couple of them on this channel. They're great big things. And when you do a book that size, it's perfect for encompassing a run. So not just a certain number of issues of a certain comic book, but a run by a team, a certain writer and a certain artist who strike magic, strike gold with the fans, and suddenly have a successful run on the book. And then for one reason or another, they leave, or one of them does, and the run falls apart, and then the book maybe muddles along, and then maybe if it's lucky later on, it has another run. I've talked about that comic book phenomenon on this channel a few times, and one of the last, in fact, the last great run on Superman, my beloved Superman, was by Peter Tomasi and Patrick Gleason, the writer Peter Tomasi and the artist Patrick Gleason, who springboarded off recent DC Comics events in which Superman was married to Lois Lane and they had a son named John, who was 8 or 9 years old. And I originally didn't think that it would work, and then I realized, no, this is perfect. This is absolutely perfect. Superman as a father is absolutely perfect. And oh my, Peter Tomasi wrote the heck out of that story. He plumbed such incredible emotional depths. Certainly helped by Patrick Gleason's artwork, the best Patrick Gleason artwork I've ever seen. But the emotional resonance of this run, of a family, not a perfect family, but a real family, a father, a mother, and a son, and the things they're going through. Oh man. I was reading it like everyone else. I was just being blown away issue by issue. And this big cinder block collects the whole thing. It collects the whole run of Peter Tomasi and Patrick Gleason on Superman. And that might seem, like gobbledygook to you if you don't follow comic books. If you know somebody who does follow comic books, if you want to increase your cool points with them, offhandedly ask them about the Tomasi Gleason run on Superman. You'll be amazed at what happens to their face. Their fans are universal. You ask a comic book fan, they're going to go, "Oh, that was so good." I feel the same way. I'm a little bit disconcerting to think it may be the last one, but you never know. One way or another, though, as usual with these big cinder blocks, I'm talking about this one, although I don't have it. I don't actually have it yet. I haven't pulled the trigger on it because it's so expensive. It's just such a big, expensive thing, but I will eventually pull the trigger on it because it's one of my favorite comic book characters in one of the best runs he's ever had. So I wanted to put it on this list. And then we'll finish up with an author that a lot of you will know, Cy Montgomery, Mind of the Octopus, has a new book called The Hummingbird's Gift. And it's a lovely thing, just lovely. It's full of scientific knowledge. If any of you who read this author's works will know how good a job is done here in working together scientific knowledge and narrative grace. But this is all about hummingbirds. I don't know how many of you have ever seen a hummingbird, or maybe, as I have many, many times, been on a patio or on a porch somewhere and had them flitting by. And for a minute, out of the corner of your eye, your brain is registering bumblebee. And then the first few times if you're not familiar with hummers, then the first few times your brain will be registering it will be registering bumblebee, but it will also be giving you little alarm signals. My first, out of the corner of your eye instinct is bumblebee. This is not a right bumblebee. There's something wrong here. And your brain usually won't distinguish that. Usually that's when your eyes get into the question. You will go and look then. What is this that seemed a little bit strange? And you'll realize it's not a bumblebee at all. It's a hummingbird. And they're amazing to watch. And they are amazing creatures. The more you know about them, the more amazing they are. And this book captures all of that. Just captures all. I've read a number of books on hummingbirds, and this is immediately became one of my favorite bird books, let alone one of my favorite hummingbird books. So if you have a bird fanatic on your list, or if you are one yourself and just don't want to admit it in public, as why would you, then this is the book for you from May. There's another book, another bird book coming out in May on peacocks that looks just fantastic, but I haven't quite got to it yet. But anyway, there you go. That is, sorry for the length of the video. That is a May TBR-BY. Just a few suggestions for your list for May, just in case they're of interest. Maybe you want to splurge on buying one of them. Maybe you want to, get onto your library, make sure that they have it, or to look for a deal or something like that. I at least wanted you to know those things were out there as a May TBR-BY. And if I remember, or am gently reminded, I will make sure to do one of these for June. But anyway, in the meantime, I'm going to wrap this up. It's gone on quite long enough. And I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.